to Season 4, Episode 7 of Upbeat from Everything Conducting. My name is John Devlin, and I am the music director of the Wheeling Symphony Orchestra.
And I'm Enrico Lopez-Yanez, Principal Pops Conductor of the Nashville Symphony, back for more action. We had a kind of different take on our podcast last time with our collaborative episode, and now we're back to a little more traditional time, so we get to hang out and chat it up again, John.
Then we're going to visit a more traditional format for our interview, which is going to be with Diane Wittry, who is the music director of the Allentown Symphony and somebody with whom I've worked for many, many years, first as a member of one of her workshops, which I went over and did in Kiev maybe 10 years ago. And then I apprenticed with her at the Allentown Symphony. And then more recently, she and I have joined each other on the conductors constituency leadership team for the league. And so I spent the time at conference with her in LA at the beginning of June. And Enrico, as you know, she's one of the foremost thinkers about what conductors do off the podium, which is certainly a big topic that we love to talk about here.
Absolutely. I enjoyed speaking with her when she joined our other podcast, the Everything Conducting Roundtable podcast, as a guest there. But I'm really looking forward to getting some sort of one-on-one time with just Diane to hear about all of her great ways of thinking. She's such an accomplished conductor, author too. I mean, if you haven't read her books, that's another great source into the mind of this fabulous conductor. So we are very excited for this. Why don't we give our first upbeat and head to the 4-4.
Welcome back to the Upbeat podcast. We're so excited now to be joined by our guest for today's episode, Diane Wittry, a dear friend of mine and a former teacher. And Diane is named nationally as one of the top 30 professional musicians by Musical America Worldwide for her work leading orchestras, and is a highly respected conductor in the United States today. She is currently the music director and conductor of the Allentown Symphony and the Garden State Philharmonic. She is also recognized as a composer and a respected conducting teacher. Her books Beyond the Baton and Baton Basics, Communicating Music Through Gestures have become standards in the conducting field. Diane, welcome to the pod.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
And Enrico and I were just talking about all of the amazing things you've contributed to people of our generation through your teaching and your books. You and I first met each other all the way out in Kiev, Ukraine, about a decade ago at one of your workshops. And then I had the pleasure of being part of the program that you have for young conductors at the Allentown Symphony, the fellowship program. And so those are some fond memories.
Yeah, and it's been really great watching your career develop over the years and seeing all the wonderful things that you're doing.
Oh, well, thank you so much. And for both Enrico and I, as we said before the camera started rolling, we are indebted to you in big ways. So that's one of the places I'd love to start, if you don't mind, with our conversation, in that you are one of the conductors in the field who so clearly and with empathy embraces the wideness of what it means to be not just a conductor, but a leader. You run orchestras, teach conducting, compose, and write these amazing books to help others. And you and I are even tag teaming a little bit on the conductor constituency at the League of American Orchestras, which is a beautiful thing that we get to do. So can you talk about how you developed this philosophy of being somebody that gives so freely to the industry, and how that has helped your career and the things that you found rewarding just in and of themselves?
Yeah, so it's interesting. I'm a person that I have a lot of interests, and I began to sort of look at successful conductors and musicians throughout the ages, and look at models like Leonard Bernstein. And Leonard Bernstein, was a composer, a conductor, a performer, a writer. He wrote for Broadway. He wrote classical things. You look at Copland. Copland also conducted and composed. You look at Michael Tilson Thomas and the videos he's done, the work he's done as first a pianist and then with orchestras. And then you look earlier in history to people like Schumann and Berlioz and even Handel being an impresario. And I suddenly started thinking, to really be a well-rounded musician and to be a well-rounded artistic leader, which is what I really see the role of the conductor is, that I wanted to expand what I did. And so I started writing books, I started composing, and everything I did, I think, brought back to my conducting a deeper understanding of music and of the overall field. So it's something I really encourage people to do, to expand what you do. And I think it's important to what I what I perceive as finding holes in the industry. So when I wrote my first book, it wasn't that I just sat down and decided to write a book. It was that I realized that there was a lack of information available to conductors on what our job is off the podium. And so I wanted to fill that void with all the things I'd had to learn kind of the hard way to help other conductors coming up not have to do it the hard way and to have a few easier ways to kind of be successful. The same with the second book I wrote, the technique book, really stemmed from recognizing that technique is so hard to teach, and could there be a simpler, more effective way to teach that to people so that we could have better conductors. And then I think I started composing because I was curious about the process. And as a composer now, I really look at scores totally differently. And instead of just accepting what's on the page, I now always ask the question, why? Why did the composer choose to do a specific thing? And it's really changed completely the way I study a score. So I think it's finding needs in the industry, fulfilling those needs in a way that makes you a better musician and a better artistic leader.
If it's okay, I'd love to dive into, as you mentioned, the off-the-podium stuff and the off-the-podium work that you have really helped educate so many people on through your books. Shameless plug, the Beyond the Baton, which I own and is something that should be on everyone's Upbeat required reading list. If you don't own it already, go out there and buy it. But that's one of the things that we really don't get taught in graduate school or oftentimes in festivals. I mean, when you have a week with a master conductor, that's not usually one of the topics that you go to. So can you tell us a little bit about how you try and work that in when you do come across young conductors and the reasons or maybe the value in learning and exploring that part of the industry more?
Yeah, well, so much of our work is off the podium with orchestras in that, particularly if you're with a regional orchestra, and the book was really written for conductors with orchestras of up to maybe $4 to $5 million in budget. So a conductor that actually is involved, perhaps going to some board meetings, involved with the artistic planning. Often we serve almost as an artistic administrator at times. Even though we have people on staff that are pushing those things through, we are responsible for a lot more things with a smaller orchestra because of the small staff. Mm-hmm. And so you need to know how to read a budget. You need to know how to speak with board members. You need to know how to be persuasive so that when you want to do something really, really kind of outside the box and challenging that you're really artistically excited about, that you can convince people that this is really a great idea. And so those types of skills we are not taught. And so when I do teach conducting workshops, we really talk about some of these other skills we need off the podium so that we can be successful leaders. We also need to be educators and to understand how the educators work in our communities and what types of programs might be effective for them. To do programming, especially community outreach in a vacuum, is just not productive. And so how do you meet with educators in your community to come up with joint ideas that you can pursue that have buy-in? And so those are the types of things that I get really excited about because I love conducting and I love the music, but I really, really love impacting an entire community through the music. And I feel that that is our job as artistic leaders.
So aside from owning and reading your book and using it as your Bible, what would be some of the ways that you would suggest young conductors get some of that practice or the practical side if you aren't, already the music director of a $2 million budget orchestra? Yeah,
so a lot of different things you can do on your own. So one thing is, part of our jobs is that we have to give a lot of speeches. Nobody tells us ahead of time that we have to give speeches, but we do pre-concert talks, we talk from the podium, we do Rotary Club talks, we do talks at conferences, we do Zoom talks. So, I say take a course in public speaking if you're not comfortable with public speaking. That's something you can do immediately. Programming, spend some time doing, programming for classical concerts, do a whole season. Force yourself to be open to more repertoire. Your boards count on you to be the expert in bringing them a variety of repertoire. So, make sure you're familiar with diverse composers of different backgrounds, composers of different ages, living composers from the past that haven't been played as much, and make your lists and do your research ahead of time, because once you get your job, there's no time. So have those favorite pieces already lined up is something you can do in advance. Take a look at budgets. Familiarize yourself with how budgets are done and how budgeting is done with an orchestra. And be respectful of budgets so that, when you're given an amount that you have to bring that concert into, whether they say it must be this number of musicians or whether it has to come in on this flat number, experiment with creating budgets in advance, and can you fit your creative concert ideas into that type of programming? So those are just a few things that you might want to experiment with.
And Diane, just one thing to add to that, because I think it's so important. You talked about programming and having ideas in advance, but one thing we don't do in graduate school is program holiday concerts or pop shows or runouts or educational things on one. And you need 20 pieces on those, not 4. Right? So
exactly.
It's another area where I learned that so distinctly from you. And then thinking about the goal of those pieces, you've talked to us about what are good audition pieces, how to end an audition concert, what are the right ways to design these different things that matter. And so I just want to echo profoundly what you're saying, is that you started me along that way of thinking, and it helped so much so quickly. And another thing that leads us to our next question that you talked about was relationship building. And I had this idea when I was a younger conductor. It's like, well, I live in Washington, D.C., so if Christoph Eschenbach ends up knowing who I am, that'll be really great. And it just, the people that actually are going to make a difference in our career may certainly well be, mentor conductor figures. But you talked to me about understanding relationships with soloists, composers, agents, administrators. And something that struck me quite emphatically was publishing houses. You have a relationship with all these great publishers. And I just wanted to explore with you, what are the types of things that you glean from those relationships? How do you go about building them? And are there other areas that you're like, as you're a young conductor, you haven't thought about this, but do this starting today?
Yeah, and all of these things are so important to developing your career. So, speaking of music publishers, I felt that those are some of my strongest relationships, because by attending conferences, and all the publishers at that time, the publishers would go to the conferences and spend time at their table gathering their materials. So 1, you get free scores, which is always great. But 2, you develop that relationship so that they begin to understand what your orchestra is, what type of music you're looking for. And you can save so much time, because I could just call the publishers and say, okay, I'm looking for an overture piece about this instrumentation. And they would do the research for me, and they would send me either, in the early days, they would actually mail you scores. Now they're going to send you links online. They're going to send you sound links. But they're going to actually do all that homework for you, which is phenomenal. And then I remember in New York, I used to be in touch with Ed Matthews at Schirmer, and I would go in and spend a whole day, and he would just pull things, and I would just spend a day listening and looking through scores and exploring what they had there. Mm-hmm. And by developing those relationships, also, one time I had a real problem where I needed some music very, very quickly, and Ed just completely saved me. And if I hadn't developed that relationship over years, that wouldn't have happened. Same things with Subito music, with Steve Culbertson. These are the people that when you get in a bind, you need something quickly or you need something at a discount. If you have those relationships that you've built over the years, and many of these people stay in these jobs for a long time, or they move to a different publishing company. So music publishers are one that I really advocate. Artist managers are really, really great to get to know, because many of them will move up through the field. So maybe you start with a relationship and they're a booking manager, but then they become a regular manager, and then they become a vice president, and they move up through the field, or they change management companies, and they, once again, can help you. When you have that kind of relationship, they know where your orchestra is, they know what your budget size is, they know that you're going to be a repeat shopper, we can call us that, then they're going to invest in you, they're going to help you out, and maybe when you don't have a lot of money because you're bringing in some other more expensive artists, they'll help you out to fill that hole. And then another time you're going to really hire one of their more expensive artists. So they know that you're going to work with them over the course of your entire life in this field. And that's what I didn't realize, is that these relationships are long-term. And then the other thing is many times people change jobs. So someone that's working maybe as an artist manager might suddenly become an artistic administrator, or they might eventually become an executive director. And so smart young people, you get to know them now, you never know where they're going to end up. So that's another important thing of staying in touch with people. And then the musicians themselves. We all know that particularly these days, musicians are on search committees. When orchestras are looking, the musicians are always asked if they know of anyone that should be lifted from that pile of 200 resumes that have come in. And so if you stay in touch with musicians and you have a good relationship with musicians, that's always going to help you in the end. And it's always going to make you a better musician, because so often musicians aren't comfortable telling us what they really think, right? It's hard for a conductor to get really good, honest feedback. But if you can develop a relationship with some musicians where they are comfortable talking to you, you will grow as a musician also. And I think that that's important for your personal growth.
That's great. So I would love to try and tackle a topic that is maybe not the most conducive for an audio podcast, but it's talking about gesture. And since you've also written the book on that, I thought John and I fully acknowledge that we have attempted, and sometimes it's more or less successful, talking about gesture without people being able to see us gesture. But you are so good in your writings and your teachings talking about, exercises that young conductors can use to develop some of the key muscles for conducting, as well as some just universal truths about conducting and gesture, regardless of the difference in physicality from one conductor to another. Could you maybe outline some of the general building blocks that you feel philosophically are important for young conductors in terms of gesture?
Yeah, and I wrote my second book, the Baton Basics book, which is about gestures, communicating music through gesture, because in teaching conducting, I realized that there was a void there, and that many conductors understood how to beat time, but they didn't understand how to communicate sound. And so I really fought with the challenge of, as you say, how do you write this down? How do you communicate this in a way that's not totally confusing? I read a lot of conducting books, checking it out, trying to see if I could figure out how other people maybe perhaps had done this well. And many of them I was totally confused. And so I came up with a way of sort of analyzing types of gestures we do naturally that we can apply to conducting, because these gestures, if we do them in the air, will invoke a certain sound response, regardless if the person on the other end of your hand is a musician or not, because you're communicating something that is organic in its communication. And so with this, as I broke it down, I began to realize, okay, we do have to have more control, like a bow hand, of when we're using our fingers, when we're using our wrist, when we're using our forehand, when we're using our forearm. So if you're a string player out there listening, it's really like string bowing technique. If we all stayed at the point of just a martelet stroke, ba, 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 it would get very boring. Our sound would be very boring. But so often with conducting, everyone conducts with an ictus beat from the forearm, and it's comparable to a martelet stroke. It has a stop at the end. It's very clear. And it's funny, when I was younger, I thought when people told me I was very clear, I thought that was a compliment. And I realized later on that's really not necessarily a compliment. You do want to be clear, but you want to be musical. You want to really convey what is the sound you want, what is the nuance, what is the character. And so it's understanding that there is not just one technique, there is multiple techniques. And the three things I'll say that I think can clearly demonstrate how you need to delve into this a little bit more is that, so we have the ictus type stroke, which the sound happens at the end of the stroke. Each sound is the end of the stroke. And there's a point after that initial impact of the beat that you cannot control, and so it can only be used for certain types of music. We have the pendulum style of beat. The pendulum style is like a tennis swing where the ball is hit in the middle and there's an energy towards it, and the beat continues afterwards. But the important thing to remember is that it happens in the middle of the stroke. And then there's what I call is sort of the weight technique, and it really comes from the Moosin technique, is where you literally are holding and conveying a sense of weight in your hands, and that weight is there all the time. Different from a pendulum where there's a moment of striking and there's a moment of release, and the weight is not in your hand the whole time. Different from an ictus, which is really impacting a point and articulation, but not really able to control anything else between the beats. And so the weight beat is, I think, the one that's taught the least in the United States. And I actually went to Russia to study this because I was fascinated with it when I was introduced to it. And so learning how to communicate weight in your gesture, and it has to do with the time between the beats. And so in the Moosin technique, it's based a little bit on sort of a circle concept where the sound happens not at 6 o'clock, which you might expect if you have a clock face, right? Not at 6 o'clock, but actually at 7 o'clock. So you pick up the sound at 6 o'clock, but the sound actually happens at 7 o'clock. And so it's understanding these three types of different types of gestures that can be applied. But then, in addition to that, with my brainstorming, I came up with different types of things like an axe stroke, like petting a cat, petting a mouse, petting a horse, so that we use different muscles, different sizes, and the concept of energy towards the beat and energy away from the beat has to be contemplated. So the difference, to just demonstrate quickly, is if you're having energy towards the beat, it might be a dart throw, like a cue, where the energy is towards the beat. And energy away from the beat with a similar type of sound would be a hot stove. So I'm going to touch the hot stove. And so, or you might have a droplet of water. Okay, so that's energy towards. I'm flicking the droplet of water, and that's one sound. Hot stove is a similar sound. It would be used for eighth notes rest, eighth note rest, but it's a different sound. And so it's coming up with a way of giving gestures that give very, very subtle differences in sound. So a spring beat is where you're just touching and lifting on a spring. It has a certain sound. There's a little bit of a give to it. Different than, say, bouncing a tennis ball. Has a little bit different sound. And so by putting it in your mind, and you can imagine the gesture, you do it naturally without any tension, but then by imagining what type of sound that would get, we begin to break that down and apply it to music. And so I'm actually working on a workbook now for my Baton Basics book that will help conductors be able to actually apply the technique, not just to be able to practice it, but to basically say, okay, here's a passage, try this now with these three different types of beats, hear the different sound in your head, or if you happen to have an ensemble, hear how they respond differently with these very subtle differences in technique. But focusing people on, here, this one you might want to try the pendulum because that's going to be a much more effective beat. This type of music you might want to try an ictus beat or a bouncing type of beat. I love the rubber band beat. This is a beat where the energy doesn't release at all between the strokes. And so that's a very, very useful beat for if you want to pull something forward, particularly with continuous eighth notes, but still have energy going on a forward motion. Where if you did that with an ictus beat, it's going to stay in place more. So it's trying to help people with something that they, and what I love about this method is people get it instantaneously, and they can instantaneously change, and they can hear the sound in the orchestra immediately change. So it's very, very exciting.
Well, Diane, that was amazing. And Enrico, we can no longer blame the fact that we're on a podcast for not talking about gesture, because you just have to be good at talking about gesture.
Oh, right. I know.
It is a tough subject, though. It is a tough subject.
Yeah. Well, I have all of these incredible ideas in my head now of what my next rehearsal is going to feel like. Let's pivot a little bit and talk about Allentown. What a profound thing it is that you have been the music director there since 1995. As somebody who is looking up at you and what you've achieved there in a community that's not so dissimilar, right? We're in the same part of the world and same type of people and place we're trying to impact. I'm in awe of what you've been able to do there. And I did some research into your the start of your tenure and found that you were there. There were just 5 subscription concerts and 2 days of school concerts when you started, an ununionized orchestra, and no shell in your hall. Are these all true facts?
These are all true facts.
Yeah.
And the hall was in quite disrepair.
And now look at what you have achieved there. It is thought of as like the model of what a great regional orchestra can be like and achieve artistically. So first of all, congratulations. And second of all, having just been in my job for a few years, you're changing board presidents and executive directors, and different people are the head of the players committee, and you have seen all of that and stayed as the constant. So what would you give as keys to your success? What are the ways you've navigated the progress you've wanted to make for the orchestra, found those improvements, and connected deeply to the community such that you were the right leader for 3 decades?
Yeah, and some people choose to stay and build, and other people choose to build for a while and then jump. So there are different types of careers, but as I mentioned earlier, I'm a builder, and I love to see and experience the impact that the music can have on the greater community, and that gives me great joy. So with Allentown, as you mentioned, we all go through multiple executive directors and administrations and board presidents, and so flexibility of work style is very, very important. You have to really morph a little bit to adjust to the different work styles of the people you're working with. So that's very, very important. For me, I knew exactly how I was going to build, and I wanted to make sure that every single year we were adding something new and challenging the board and the community and exciting the board and the community about what we were doing. And so even though we evaluate some of the things we started early on, we are not doing anymore. They were great projects, but they kind of had their life cycle. But some of the things that we were able to do is keeping artistic quality always at the forefront was one of my goals, which I believe helps with fundraising. Obviously, you can't grow an orchestra without having the dollars to back up the growth. So that's very, very important. And it's all based upon personal relationships. So being a music director that builds those relationships over time is very, very important. But as the orchestra got better and better and was, of course, unionized, and more musicians winning the auditions were not from the region, I formed the Allentown Symphony Chorus because I wanted us to maintain a connection, a very deep connection to our community. We also have recently formed our musician chair sponsorship program, and I'm very proud to say that all of our musician chairs are sponsored, all of them. And that is also about building relationships between our donors in the community and our musicians. And so we have a dinner every year that they get together. Our musicians send emails to their donors. They communicate. It's all about building relationships. We started about 11 years ago our El Sistema Lehigh Valley program, which serves underprivileged students. We have about 110 students in the program, and that was a big leap of faith. We went into that without having the funding in place, but we felt it was important, and our donors have really stepped up. We started doing chamber music, featuring our own musicians, because I wanted them to have a place that they had some artistic say and that they could really be the stars individually. We added pops concerts because I know that not everybody in our community is interested in classical music, and therefore I believe the orchestra must serve all of the constituencies in the community, and pops concerts was a very logical next step. we started to build our community engagement programs by our Young Musicians String Festival, which is for very young musicians, and they actually learn arrangements of some of the pieces we're playing on concerts, and then they come to these concerts with their parents, so their parents can see, particularly for a young string player, that there's a chance that there's a future in this, that they're going to actually at some point sound really good, because beginning string players, it's hard. It's really hard. We started doing family concerts, and my latest one that I'm very pleased that we're finishing our 3rd year of a composer in residence, which is very, very exciting. But not to just have a composer in residence, I built a composer consortium of 8 local composers from universities and high schools throughout the region. And so they are our avenues to all of the composers in the area. And they also help teach, and we do a summer workshop, we do a call for scores, and we do chamber music concerts, but featuring submissions from people in our community, which I think is really, really exciting, that we're nurturing that creative spirit. And then we also started the Conducting Fellows program, which we're in our, I think, 11th year, and over 60 conductors have gone through that program, which is very, very exciting. And we do 2 competitions, a big national competition with a $12,000 prize, and then also local competitions with smaller prizes, but wanting to encourage on both levels. And so building not only for our own community, but also building to put the orchestra on the map nationally was one of my goals, which increases the fundraising because the donors see that the orchestra is getting recognition on a high level.
I'm just floored at how much you guys do. I just don't know what to, it's incredible.
It keeps us very, very busy.
And what's so incredible is that is all done, like you mentioned earlier, with the size staff that you have compared to somewhere, say like Nashville, where, maybe we have a larger staff, but I'm so floored by the amount you are accomplishing with that staff size and that budget, and it's just so commendable. That's incredible.
Well, thank you. And in addition to that, we own a concert hall. So on a very small budget, we also produce a whole series of jazz cabarets. We do the Met Opera HD, and in my tenure there, we have completely renovated and expanded the concert hall. So we've renovated all the building, and then we built an additional building. So I give credit to, I have a phenomenal board. I have a lot of past presidents that have all stayed on the board. We have some various generous people, and it's really been a wonderful experience here with the Allentown Symphony Orchestra.
So none of us have any excuses anymore now. I mean, you have proven that any orchestra can do anything they set their minds to, and more than that. That's incredible.
I've always heard, it's never a problem of money. It's always a problem of vision. And so, particularly if you're out there listening, get that vision going in your mind, that idea of what could be, and talk about it with people and find out what resonates and what people get excited about. We're working now on developing a diversity fellow program, and I'm hoping that will be rolled out next year. But it's continually finding out how you can do more good in your community and share the music with more people.
Well, I hope that a lot of our listeners are inspired and will try to take on that work themselves. As you know, a lot of our listeners are young conductors just getting their start and have many years of growth ahead of themselves to reach the ability to impact in the ways that you are able to in Allentown. But do you have maybe one recommendation for our young listeners out there, maybe the single most important piece of advice you would give to a young conductor? That's a lot of pressure on this question, but Phil, if you have any thoughts on that.
I'll give 2 things. So one is really you have to develop the discipline to study every day and to continually be challenging yourself to be learning and growing. And that's tough because you get your degree, you study, you're working really hard, and then you get out in the real world. And suddenly you're having to make a living. You might be doing a job outside of music, doing something else. How do you have the discipline to continue working on becoming the best conductor you can be. So first off, discipline, and second off, perseverance. Because I always say it's often the game of the last man standing. Who is still there? So many people give up. And so you have to not be discouraged. There's a lot of rejection, right, in this field as a conductor. A lot of rejection, and you have to just let it roll off you and realize you are where you are. And if every day you're getting better and every day you're working on learning and growing, you're going to make it as a conductor. And also remember that we need conductors, excellent conductors, for all of the ensembles in the world, not just the United States, all of the ensembles. And that means high schools, colleges, church groups, community orchestras, youth orchestras, ballet orchestras, opera orchestras, regional orchestras, professional orchestras. They all need phenomenal conductors and artistic leaders. And so your job is to bloom where you're planted and to make that the absolute best experience you can for all the people listening to your music.
Well, Diane, I think you can tell Enrico and I are incredibly inspired, and we cannot wait for a couple weeks from now when so too will our audience, because this was a beautiful half hour to spend with you, and thank you so much for joining us on the podcast.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.
And now, the code.
Well, this was a special guest-filled episode, John, and I am so thankful for it because both Jason and Diane just had so many key words of wisdom, I think, for our audience. And I mean, I learned so much. I'm sure that you did too, as did our listeners.
Yeah. In one of my questions, I compared, what Diane has as a structure to what I have here at Wheeling, because, Wheeling is not a place like any I've ever worked in. It doesn't have a thriving artistic scene that international people are coming in and contributing and hundreds of people making a living doing art. It's a different format, and Allentown is a much bigger city than Wheeling, but it's in the same region of the country. The same type of people come to our concerts. And so that's why I look up to Diane as one of the very, very biggest mentors in my life and someone I aspire to be like. It's impossible to hear her talk about the myriad programs that she has started in Allentown and not think that every one of those is for the good of the community, derived from community need. And we use that word community as a buzzword all the time, but I think, correct me if I'm wrong, I just get the sense from someone like you that works at the biggest orchestras in the best cities and sees a lot, that you were also impressed with Allentown, Pennsylvania.
Oh my gosh, 100%. I mean, we talked a little bit about this off the mic, but, as young conductors, sometimes our goals or our drive is, one day I'm going to conduct the Berlin Philharmonic or XYZ orchestra. And that might be great. And that might be a nice, feather in your cap. But the kind of work and impact that someone like Diane is having in her community, the legacy of growing an organization. And, she's talking about 110 kids in a young string program. Year after year after year, you are literally changing the fabric of that community and impacting so many lives that, I mean, what more could one hope or wish for out of a career than to have something like that and be able to grow and see something flourish through music, through the music making that we've done and trained ourselves to be able to do. That to me is incredible.
And it was very heartening to hear her say things like, a lot of people blame a lack of resources. She didn't quite say it this way, but really sometimes it's a lack of vision. Mm-hmm. If you are a music director that's like, I want to conduct Brahms symphonies and the Berlioz overture beforehand and a concerto with someone famous, it's like, okay, but if you're a listener to our podcast regularly, you know that Enrico and I both believe in figuring out what your goal as an artist is that differentiates you from others. And I think you could hear that Diane, with 27 years of experience in Allentown, has created dozens of things that are unique to her, and some things that feel like new ideas to the younger generation. Right. It's like, oh no, Diane Wittry did those 15 years ago. And it's important to hear that and hear the things that, I mean, she's told me about mistakes that she's made and how to avoid them, and then she's told me about how to be successful. And I have a bookshelf in my office with a lot of books on it, and some of which I've never read, as I'm sure we're all guilty of. But one book that has been read many times is Beyond the Baton. There is invaluable information there about how to do so many different things, how to navigate with a board, how to write a good cover letter, how to program a good audition concert, what to interview questions. I mean, everything. Just, if you haven't done it yet and you listen to this podcast, go buy that book and spend a weekend and ingest it, because it's too important not to. And
just to touch on something else you said, you know, if your drive and your desire is to conduct a Brahms symphony with a Berlioz overture at the beginning of the concert, that's great too, and that can have an impact. But the key is that you have to find ways to connect that and make it impactful, because simply the act of presenting it and putting it out there because those are the pieces you want to do, that's just displaying art. That doesn't mean you're necessarily going to have an impact with it. And there are so many ways, whether it's through pre-concert lectures, going out into the community, finding community connections, or educating the board, or young musicians, like Diane was saying, if they're learning a basic version of a Brahms melody and then connecting that. I mean, there are ways to have that same repertoire that you want to be doing maybe, but having a much stronger impact in your orchestra, organization, and community. If you get creative with it, if you try and find the ways to make that impactful. And it can be just as impactful as having a living composer on your concert if you're creative about it, if you come up with a way to make that connect to the audience. And I think that's important to keep in mind.
This has been a rather rambunctious episode of the Upbeat podcast. Make sure, as always, to check out the website, everythingconducting.com. There is new material headed up there every single month. And also, don't forget to check out our Roundtable podcast feed. That's also available on all podcast platforms. And we look forward to sharing with you our October episode. You'll hear that on our next Upbeat.